whether Elise likes it or not.
Yeah. What is time, I said?
We left this yesterday in chapter 11, section 11 of the book. And in what remains of this session, I hope to give you some further insight into this process and say a little bit about section 12, though not very much. There isn't, in my view, very much to be said, and probably the less said the better. We'd taken our story yesterday as far as the awakening of mind, the incarnation of the Manasaputras. And I have no intention in the time available of trying to outline the processes which took place during the subsequent races. But I would like to read to you, share with you, a couple of passages which to me are very suggestive of the state of being, the state of consciousness which resulted from this incarnation, which is so different from ours today. I want to try and show this contrast. As a result of the incarnation of this Manasaputra, the awakening of mind, the development of self-perception and so forth, men felt themselves to be gods in this third age, in this third race. And some of the passages which are given in volume 2 are descriptive of this intimacy with nature, and certainly reflecting something perhaps of what Geoffrey was saying this afternoon, had no need for thought or concept and so forth. So I thought I'd read you a couple of passages. One of them is in fact quoted in the book, so you can follow that one in the book indeed itself. And that is on page 131, section 11.15. You don't, let us read it out to you. You don't need to follow it, but you can if you wish. So this is a description, a rather beautiful description it seems to me, of the processes at work after the awakening of mind. No sooner had the mental eye of man been opened to understanding than the third race felt itself one with the ever-present, as the ever-to-be unknown and indivisible all. Isn't that lovely? The one universal deity, endowed with divine powers and feeling in himself his inner God. Each felt he was a man-god in his nature, though an animal in his physical self. The struggle between the two began from the day they tasted the fruit of the tree of wisdom, a struggle for life between the spiritual and the psychic and physical. So the pull that we still feel today was felt by them, but at that time they were preeminently, for want of a better word, spiritual beings, rather than the psychophysical beings we feel ourselves to be today. Those who conquered the lower principles by obtaining mastery over the body joined the sons of light. Those that fell victim to their lower nature became the slaves of matter. From sons of light and wisdom, they ended by becoming the sons of darkness. They had fallen in the battle of mortal life with life immortal. And those so fallen became the seeds of future generations of Atlanteans. And guess who that is, folks? That's us. Unless you feel yourself to have joined the ranks of the Sons of Light, I guess that we'll have to fall into that latter category. But this is a gradual process, and one which I'll come back to in just a minute. But there's another passage that I'd like to read you, because it gives you, I think, a feel for the state of being and consciousness, again, at this point, after the awakening of mind, while yet they felt themselves to be spiritual beings, a man God in his inner nature. Isn't that lovely? I am going to read you a passage from volume 2, page 272. I have no idea where else it comes. It's a commentary on stanza 10, commentary A, for those of you with the Adyar edition. 272. And it's a comment on whether the third race had religions, as we have religions. And it goes as follows. At the dawn of his consciousness, the man of the third root race had thus no beliefs that could be called religion. That is to say, he was equally as ignorant of gay religions full of pomp and gold as of any system of faith or outward worship. But if the term is to be defined as the binding together of the masses in one form of reverence, paid to those we feel higher than ourselves, of piety, as a feeling expressed by a child towards a loved parent, then even the earliest Lemurians had a religion, and a most beautiful one, from the very beginning of their intellectual life. Had they not their bright gods of the elements around them, and even within themselves? Was not their childhood passed with, nursed and tended by, those who had given them life and called them forth to intelligent, conscious life? We are assured it was so, and we believe it. It's a lovely passage, isn't it? So the picture that these and other passages like it paint is of the awakening to, as she says, intellectual life, into a self-conscious identity. This would have been the period in which men woke up and realized that they were themselves. This is where the allegory of the Garden of Eden comes into its own. They had now eaten of the apple, and they had awoken to a sense of identity. But, as the first passage I read you indicated, we were still following the involutionary arc, and this almost spiritual consciousness was still being drawn into the matrix of psychic and physical life. It was a battle fought, and for the most of us, and although she makes it sound as if it were a disaster, I don't think it should necessarily be read in that way. I think it was, to a degree, an inevitable process that this bright spiritual consciousness, this immediate awareness of the immediacy of nature, the gods and the lives, the elementals, and the whole processes of nature, that this was lost as they were drawn into a greater and greater degree of separateness and individuality. And to a degree, as I sense it, this was the intention of the whole process, that it should be so, that we should end up at the bottom of the arc of descent, where we each felt ourselves totally separate. I believe that it is only at that point that we can really get to grips with our fundamental identity. Only in the utmost separation, you might say, can we really turn round and look into ourselves and find out truly who we are. But in the process of so doing, there is going to be much pain, because we will make some fundamental mistakes in that inquiry. Hence the remarks that she makes in that first passage that I read out to you, the one on page 131 in my book. The struggle between the two began from the day they tasted of the fruit of the tree of wisdom, a struggle for life between the spiritual and the psychic and physical. Well, that is where the process began. Where we are now is well into the culmination of that process, and the spiritual has been overshadowed, eclipsed by the growth of the psychophysical organism that we're all so familiar with. Skipping over completely then no, not entirely skipping over it. There's one passage I can't resist reading because it has such considerable significance. Just turning over to page 132 in the book, again from a passage very nearby, she comments now on the subsequent development of this divine consciousness within us, and talks of the subsequent development in the fourth race, when spirituality and all the divine powers and attributes of the Deva man, of the third, had been made the handmaidens of the newly awakened physiological and psychic passions of the physical man, instead of the reverse, the third eye lost its power. You see the process, that it was almost as if there was a fascination with the newly developing psychic component within him. What we think of as thoughts and emotions were new to this man of the third race and the early fourth and so forth, and it was a fascination with what was involved and what it meant, which drew the consciousness down into this whole complex. And remember that the whole physical stream of evolution was also moving down from the astral into the physical, and the whole physical complex was becoming more structured, more limiting, and consciousness operating through a physical vehicle was again limiting this consciousness. But such was the law of evolution, and it was, in strict accuracy, no fall. It wasn't our fault. It was part of the law that it should be so. The sin, and this is a critical sentence, the sin was not in using those newly developed powers, but in misusing them. In making the tabernacle designed to contain a god, the one that we saw in the previous passage, the fane, the temple, of every spiritual iniquity. And that is she's emphasized the word spiritual iniquity there, spiritual evil. We often associate the inner with the good and the beautiful and so forth, and the outer with the unclean and the degrading and so forth. But here she uses the term spiritual iniquity for these godlike beings of the third race and early fourth. How can this be so, we might ask? And she emphasizes this in the passage immediately underneath it, where she says, while in the case of the Atlanteans, it was precisely the spiritual being which sinned, the spirit element still being the master principle in those days. Thus it is in those days that the heaviest karma of the fifth race was generated by our monads. You and me, folks, we were the Atlanteans, we were the Lemurians. It was we who did it. I think no escape.
We pay for it now.
We pay for it now. But it was Eva who pointed out to me this morning, reminded me of a passage wherein it says that the less favoured amongst us, the classes of monads who represent the lowest classes within the human kingdom, made it into human form only after this had happened. And they are not partakers of this particular sin, and therefore are the more favoured among humanity, just because they do not have this heavy karma of having made these terrible blunders in the third and fourth races. So there's food for thought. Maybe it was best to be a laggard after all. But such are the complexities of the process. So these just give you some of the flavours of the process of involution and the diminution of the span of consciousness, the dwindling of the faculties of consciousness from the third through the fourth and into the fifth race, just as the giant's stature decreased and dwindled into this 6-foot body that we occupy today, or 6'4" in some cases. So the consciousness and the faculty that we could exercise, the powers of perception with which we were originally blessed. So those too dwindled and lessened until our consciousness was wholly focused in this psychophysical organism through the brain and its senses, and that's where we find ourselves today. All of these are echoes of the golden age, which is so represented in mythology and so forth, when men were gods or walked with gods. And it is a memory of this primeval consciousness which we once had, and which it is our destiny to return to reawaken. However, let us come to where we are now. Now, this awakening of mind and the developing of this high consciousness within us is not something which has gone within us, but it is something which has been overshadowed, as I prefer to think of it, something which has been obscured by subsequent development. It is still there, it's permanently there, it couldn't possibly not be there, and it can still be evoked and reached. It's a little picture, a little diagram, which I'll put up on the board in just a moment, which perhaps gives you a way of grasping what I want to convey. I can put this up in complete contrast to ways in which I suspect people think of the constitution of man, either as layers of an onion to be peeled off. There's the physical body on the outside, we peel that off, and we'll get to the etheric body next in that, we peel that off, and then we get to whatever it is, and so forth, and you peel it away. Well, like an onion, there isn't anything left when you've got to the middle. Or perhaps you think of it rather like those Russian dolls which you unscrew, and there's another little doll inside it, and you unscrew that one, there's another little doll inside that. Or a set of Chinese boxes, each with another box inside it, and the principle sort of nested one inside another. But this, I think, is wrong for a number of reasons. It's wrong because there never is an ultimate doll, an ultimate box inside the whole lot, which is what we're ultimately trying to find. And it's wrong because it's going in the wrong direction. As you go inward in that model, it's getting smaller and smaller and less significant, you might say. Whereas what is inside is getting larger and larger and more significant in the picture that I would like to present. So perhaps we could represent this in a completely different way. And let us picture to ourselves, oh, it's not a bad circle, is it? Yeah. A bit egg-shaped, but there it is. As a result of all these exercises that Geoffrey's been having to do this afternoon. Imagine, if you will, that this is the span of our total being. If you want to put words to it, then you could say that this was the auric egg, mentioned by Madame Blavatsky as being of enormous significance. It's the white disc mentioned in the proem. It's the white disc with the point consciousness in the middle of it. It is the seventh principle that I've quoted to you on a number of occasions from the back of the book, where it says it's neither quality nor quantity nor yet form that are meant, but that space on which are impressed all the effects of everything that we have done. So, not really a circle, it's an image, it's a picture, don't take it too seriously. But this represents the span of our total being, all that we know, all that we are, all that we can be. Let us suppose that within this, the arrival of the Manasaputra has generated within it, so to speak, a focus. And this represents a limitation which is less than the whole, and therefore represents a focusing process taking place And this represents the span of consciousness of the indwelling ego in man. Now, I'm using these terms advisedly, and I have given you at the back of the book some terms about the constitution of man taken from the literature, and she uses ego as opposed to self in a very specific term. Self is a term which does not have necessarily the connotation of manas associated with it. It's not necessarily a reflective consciousness. This point in the fundamental is the self, you might say. Within this self, within this circle, the same point is now the ego. Same thing, no different, no other, but now with a different quality to it, welling up as a different stream of consciousness, or a modified stream of consciousness, which we call ego, and by which we mean having that quality of reflexive consciousness, knowing of itself. And this is the being that woke up gradually during the third race. This was the being that felt itself at one with the gods of the elements, and felt within itself its divine essence, and knew itself to be a man-god. Within this arena, as the involutionary process went on, gradually was formed an even more restrictive circle. And this was the growing psychophysical being, which culminates in the physical beings we feel ourselves to be today, our personalities, if you will. So, I don't know what word you want to put in here. I don't know that I have any words to put on it, really. No, let's not use words. Who worries about words, eh? No, we don't want any words. Jeffrey's told us we don't need any words, so we'll do with symbols which appeal to the inner consciousness, rather than words which appeal to the brain mind. This same dot in the middle, which was the indwelling egoic consciousness, now dwindles into the egoic with a little e consciousness, the consciousness of the personality.
It's in a different plane, isn't it? It's come out of the ball, so to speak.
Yes, but nonetheless, the root of the point is still the same point.
It's attached to the one inside.
It's not even attached to it. It's just is it.
Yeah.
It could be no other. It's the same welling up from the center of the heart of cosmos. You remember that passage that I asked Joy to read out in the footnote this morning, in that passage from the chapter that you were reading? Was it Divine Thought and
Primordial substance and divine thought.
exactly so. And it talked about it, a stream focused in a particular vehicle wells up as a particular form of consciousness. Imagine this then as the stream welling up in successive forms as a different consciousness. It's the same stream running through the whole process, but depending on the limitation, so it wells up in a different way. Now this represents the transient personnel existence, which is changed in each life. So during incarnation, this circle now is in existence. And within this circle is born the personality. This is the psychophysical man. Any terms that you care to use. Now imagine, if you will, further, to take this analogy just a stage further, that each of these circles is overlaid on the one above, or the one surrounding it. This consciousness overlays and obscures the consciousness which underlies it. Just as in its turn, this consciousness overlays and obscures the consciousness on which it is based in its turn. If this could be obliterated, if this can be erased, so to speak, completely, then what is there anyway must emerge. It cannot be otherwise. And if we were to take it still further, should this whole if we want to put it here, we can say individuality then this would re-emerge. And in the far, far future, when this too, in its turn, is reabsorbed, is worked through, then whatever this represents, the divine man, can't write. The divine man has got smudged. Adam Cadmon will re-emerge and will wake up. Now, something of this process is indicated by some of the passages I'd now like to draw your attention to, again, from passages which I've included in the book. It's this model that I'll now refer to as we go on. The first that I would like to draw your attention to is the process which is involved in incarnation. What the passage that we're going to look at is going to say is this, that this, which represents what we would call higher mind, this intermediate circle here, in order to awaken mind in the personal man, has to, what word do we use, emanate a portion of itself which becomes associated with, animates and wells up within the matrix of the physical man through his brain and senses, and becomes the brain-based mind that we know today. And as a result of that, we can say that in a certain sense we have now two minds. There is the lower personal mind and the higher egoic mind. But these circles cannot be crossed easily. This is the point. These are ring pass knots in the way that we talked about them previously. The brain-based mind, which is based within this ring pass knot, cannot of itself become anything else. This is the chrysalis, if you will, which cannot become a butterfly while yet remaining a chrysalis. For the butterfly to emerge, the chrysalis will have to be completely destroyed, obliterated, however we wish to view it. This is a limitation. This is what I was saying earlier in my talks about the falsity of the image of the lighthouse, where there are just so many stages of consciousness, and it just takes a little bit to get to the next one, and a little bit to get to the next one, and a little bit to get to the next one. Within this, what we know to be our own waking consciousness, there are innumerable degrees within our states of consciousness, from the highest degrees within meditation, perhaps, through all sorts of degrees to the lowest hells that in which we might suffer, through personal loss and tragedy and so forth. But they are all of a degree, they're all of a kind, born within the matrix of the personality. To touch the consciousness, to awaken the consciousness of the individuality is of a different order. And those who imagine that just by doing a little bit more and a little bit more, that somehow or another they're going to arrive at the consciousness of the individuality, the indwelling monastic ego, I think are sorely mistaken. The difficulty is indicated in a couple of the passages which I'd like to draw your attention to. I can't stress enough just what is involved here. So, on page 133, in paragraph 1117, I've quoted you a passage from the Collected Writings, volume 12. This is from Madame Blavatsky's Esoteric Instructions, which was an eye-opener, a mind-opener when I read it, and there are a number of passages which really stick in my mind, and this is certainly one of them. She says, "In truth and in nature, the two minds, the spiritual and physical or animal," and these are the two that I've identified here, this mind and this one, are one. The two are one, but separate at reincarnation. For while that portion of the divine which goes to animate, notice that, goes to animate this, animate consciously the personality, separating itself like a dense but pure shadow from the divine ego, wedges itself into the brain and senses of the uterine babe at the completion of the 7th month. While that's happening, the higher manus does not unite itself with the child before the completion of the first 7 years of its life. There's so much in that which is worth thinking about. The lower, what she calls the detached essence, the reflection, whatever its nature is one of the ingredients of the cake which goes to make up the personal psychophysical man. It is one of the ingredients and is intricately, intimately woven into the fabric of our, I would suggest, our brains and nervous systems. And without that, even the brain and its nervous systems wouldn't function properly. That is the lower, and with that, the whole psychophysical organism can live. Once that has matured itself sufficiently, and she says here, at the 7th year, then the overshadowing and all-embracing egoic nature can reflect itself in the now mature psychophysical organism. It has gone through its process of gestation, not just as a physical being, but as a psychological being, and the influence of the higher ego is now felt within it. Going back to talking about what's happening in here, though, this detached essence, or rather the reflection or shadow of the higher manas, she's groping around for words. What words do you use for it? The higher manas becomes, as the child grows, a distinct thinking principle in man, its chief agent being the physical brain. A distinct thinking principle. And that is what we use all the time. And we do not have access, except under extremely rare circumstances, to the consciousness which is proper to the individuality, the ego. Just how rare that is that we should be able to touch on the higher orders, which are our heritage. They are us. It is for us to achieve, but mostly not during incarnation, is indicated in a passage which I've quoted also from Collected Writings, Volume 12, from an article called Psychic and Noetic Action. Psychic, of course, is the lower. The noetic, presumably from the Greek nous, is indicative of the higher mind, and hence the contrast that is being made between the two. This leads us to see, she says, the difference between the purely noetic, the higher, and the terrestrial psychic visions of seership and mediumship. So the noetic are the seership, the terrestrial psychic are the mediumistic. The former, that's the noetic, the higher, can be obtained by one of two means. A, on condition of paralyzing at will the memory and instinctual, independent actions of all the material organs and even cells in the body of flesh. You do that? An act which, once the light of the higher ego has consumed and subjected, that's what she said, I've put subjugated, perhaps it makes more sense, subjugated forever the passional nature of the personal lower ego is easy, but requires an adept. No trouble if you're an adept. So that's one way of liberating the inner higher ego. Or, maybe this is easier, and B, of being a reincarnation of one who, in a previous birth, had obtained through extreme purity of life and effort in the right direction, almost to a yogi state of holiness and saintship. Well, you're an adept or you're a saint. One of the two. Or, there's a let out. There is also a third possibility of reaching in mystic visions the planes of the higher manas, but it is only occasional and does not depend on the will of the seer, but on the extreme weakness and exhaustion of the material body through illness and suffering. There's your third way. You can be an adept, a saint, or you can be at death's door. So take your pick. But that passage, taken seriously, is indicative of just how difficult it is and just how different is the quality of this inner egoic consciousness. Now, just to emphasize this point, if it needs any emphasis, I'd like you to now have a look at a passage on page 136. Which is from the Mahatma Letters, wherein it describes the nature of an adept, and Joy has made reference to this passage previously, but we'll have a look at it a little more closely now in relation to what we've just been discussing. This letter was written to Sinnett because he was presumably under misconceptions as to the nature of the adept and his powers. So the Mahatma writes him this to set him straight. This comes in one of the letters called the Famous Contradictions, wherein Sinnett had set out a list of supposed contradictions in the letters that he'd received from the Mahatmas. The Mahatmas reply saying that there weren't contradictions at all, and only in one case out of 12 was there even a possibility of confusion, and we would get not a farthing for damages. But before they go into the replies, they say there are a series of things that you must know and should be made aware of concerning adeptship, and this is where this particular passage comes from. And as you see, it's a series of numbered points. 1, an adept, the highest as the lowest, is one only during the exercise of his occult powers. Their emphasis, not mine. The highest as the lowest. No difference. 2, whenever these powers are needed, the sovereign will unlocks the door to the inner man, the adept, who can emerge and act freely, but on condition that his jailer, the outer man, will be either completely or partially paralyzed, as the case may require. So, using his terms, what we've got here, paradoxically, is the outer man. I say paradoxically because on my diagram he's right at the middle of the whole thing, but in terms of consciousness, this is the way it's described, and it's an analogy which is used also in another passage we're going to be looking at. So, this man must be either completely or partially paralyzed. His consciousness, his functions, his faculty must be in total abeyance in order that the inner man, the consciousness of this individuality, should emerge and act freely. Now, how is that to be done? Well, he then gives 4 ways in which it's to be done. And it's rather interesting just to consider them, even if they don't necessarily mean a great deal to us. As the case may require, either A, mentally and physically, in other words, you wipe out the whole shebang, the whole lot, as far as the personality is concerned, that would be complete oblivion, mentally and physically. Mentally, but not physically. In other words, the physical form is still awake, functioning, but there's no consciousness. And they quote an example a little later on of one of his chelas, Dwal Kul, who, while communicating with a distant correspondent, had done just exactly this. He was not there mentally, but he was still active, walking around apparently, physically, walked into a beam and broke his nose. So it gives you an idea of just how separable these things are, like sleepwalking perhaps. Mentally, but not physically. Physically, but not entirely mentally. In other words, there would still be some residual consciousness in the outer man, perhaps as in a daydream or something like that, where you are vaguely aware of the conditions which are going on around you, but you're not paying attention to it. Some psychics who describe a state somewhat like this, that they are still generally aware of the world around them, though not of details and events and so forth. They're not asleep, but they're also equally not fully awake. It's just to use an analogy. The one which is really fascinating is the last one, D, neither. In other words, neither of those are paralyzed, but with an akashic film interposed between the outer and the inner man. Don't ask me what that means, because I haven't the faintest idea. I suspect if I did, I'd probably be an adept. And as a result of that, as you can see, again, like the passage that we've just been looking through, to achieve the liberation of this inner consciousness during life is that difficult. There is a discontinuity here. There is a radical difference between the consciousness of the outer man being based on his brain and physical senses, and the consciousness of the inner man, which is not so based. Having liberated this inner man, what is his consciousness like, we might well ask? Well, it's almost impossible for us, I suspect, to really say too much about that. But a few hints, I think, are available. And one of the hints, which has always appealed to me, which I think I made reference to earlier in the course, is in paragraph 1118, back on pages 134 and 135. It's a lengthy extract, which we won't read entirely through now, which comes from an article entitled Dreams, originally published in the Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge, and now available in Collected Writings, again volume 12, as you can see. In this article, there's much fascinating information about the nature of the dream life. But this passage is an indication of the fact that in certain circumstances, during the sleep of the physical man, the inner man, the ego, can indeed emerge. He, in other words, wakes up during the sleep of the physical man. And again, the same terms that we've used before, the outer and the inner man, are used in this passage as well. So let's just look at a little bit of it. She starts, but if we admit the existence of a higher or permanent ego within us, which ego must not be confused with what we call the higher self. No, indeed. The term that she's using for the higher self would be the dot in the largest circle, the monad, the Atman possibly even. These are terms that she defines in the Key to Theosophy, and I have included at the back of the book in the appendix. So do not, pray, confuse those terms. So if we would admit the existence of a higher ego within us, we can comprehend what we often regard as dreams, generally regarded as idle fancies, are in truth stray pages torn out from the life and experience of the inner man, and the dim recollection of which, at the moment of awakening, become more or less distorted by our physical memory. There's a lot of fascinating information in this article on dreams, and she says that what we in waking consciousness remember as a dream has in fact been constructed in our psyche on the moment of waking up. And although we have a recollection that it has been time sequenced and goes back through hours and possibly days, depending on how long the dream was, all of that has been fabricated on the moment of waking. And this becomes particularly significant in the case of these so-called egoic dreams, because the ego is not in the same order of time that we are, nor is it dealing in images of the senses, colours and sound and qualities. And so whatever has been retained from this inner consciousness has passed through the filter of our psychic content of our knowledge and memory and perceptions and imaginings, and we have clothed that which is truly formless knowledge in something which we can understand. Maybe it wells up as symbol, maybe it wells up as memories of the doings of the personal man, and so forth. And that's what we remember when we wake up.
You well, good now?
So the passage goes on to ask some questions about this, and skipping to the second paragraph where it begins, we might as well compare. Let's read on from there. We might as well compare the real ego to a prisoner, and the physical personality to the jailer of his prison. The outer man literally imprisons the inner man. The consciousness, the bright consciousness of the psyche, completely overshadows the dark underlying consciousness, the holistic consciousness of the indwelling ego, hence the idea of a prisoner. If the jailer falls asleep, the prisoner escapes. So if the personality, personal consciousness fades out, as it does in sleep perhaps, then the underlying dark consciousness of the inner man emerges. Or at least passes outside the walls of his prison. He's not permanently escaped, it's only let out on a chain, so to speak. The jailer is half asleep and looks, nodding all the time, out of the window, through which he can catch only occasional glimpses of his prisoner. The brain and its physical organism is not of the right order to capture the experiences of the inner man, but something of it, analogues of it, are captured and filtered, and that's what we're going to remember as dreams. Catching occasional glimpses of his prisoner, as he would a kind of shadow moving in front of it. But what can he perceive, and what can he know of the real actions, and especially the thoughts of his charge? In the thoughts of the real man, or the immortal individuality, listen to this, the pictures and visions of the past and the future are as the present. I wonder if that rings any bells with what Joy was saying yesterday. The pictures of the past and the future are as the present. Nor are his thoughts like ours, subjective pictures in our cerebration, in other words, internal images in our brains. This is how we normally conceive of things. His are not like that. His are living acts and deeds, present actualities. It's a fascinating phrase that she's used there, living actualities, living acts and deeds, present actualities. Immediately apparent, not thought of, not remembered, not imagined, but immediate. There's one or two phrases that HBB uses. On the higher plane, she says, one sees noumena. One of the phrases she uses in her instructions. The thing in itself, rather than the phenomena, the thing as it appears. And in another place, one of the Mahatmas says, life in spirit is as difficult for some as floating is for some physical bodies. And he goes on to say, although all physical bodies are in fact lighter than water, some can float and some can't. And so it is in the inner realms. Some can maintain their identity and float, so to speak, in the inner worlds, others can't. Well, that's about all I think I have time to say about section 11. So before I go on to say a little bit about section 12, is there anything that you want to ask so far? Yanthi.
Could I just comment on this business of the three different kinds of people who have mystical visions in varieties of religious experience? William James, he refers to the criticism that was the reason why the hard-headed psychologists of the late 19th century rejected the reality, the validity of the mystical vision on the very grounds that some of the mystics and so-called saints were very sick people, like Pascal and so on. And William James comments that perhaps that is one of the conditions to make possible the vision.
Yes, yes, that's very interesting. It certainly would seem to be borne out by what this is. It does, doesn't it?
Yes.
And the Besant has a passage like that too, where he said it is a condition of higher vision.
Yes, yes. Unless we have the appropriate actual training. Anything else?
There is something in here which says that the fifth will finish with a great cataclysmic thing. Any idea of timing?
Sorry, no previsions of the future. They come a little more expensive. No, I don't know. She doesn't say. She does suggest that it's a good way off. I think we're fairly safe for the time being.
Yes, well it says we will have got to our peak before it happens.
Yes, but where's the peak?
We're there yet.
Well, where's the peak? I mean, after all, we're already in our fifth sub-race, which is more than halfway through the race itself.
Interesting that she uses, the Mahatma uses the term arrested in its
Yes,
downward.
yes.
Yes,
It's
so
progress towards absolute evil.
Yes, that
Yeah.
there is some factor in the system that seems to arrest this.
Yes, yes.
Certainly not someone outside.
Well, that's right.
But it is arrested. Now, it may well be that it's one of the functions of one of these other hierarchies, as it were, to intervene, to arrest it. It's hard to say what you mean by it.
Well, it's interesting that they're always accompanied by geological upheaval. And they do say that those geological upheavals come at their appointed place in the cycle and can neither be advanced nor retarded. And so there's a sort of synchronicity at work here, that both the geological process and the psycho-spiritual processes are interlinked.
They're very closely interlinked.
Adam, on page 134, when you read to get the mystic state by illness and suffering, maybe we can write here, and by devotion. Is the same, but another way.
Ultimately, yes.
Yes.
I mean, this is our heritage. This is where we are going, but it's going to be dependent on effort that we make. And my warning is that I don't think it's something that it's at all easy to do. Yes, gradually, as we get there, as we evolve certainly through the fifth round, we shall achieve this degree and order of consciousness. This whole outer man that you see here is a temporary phase in our evolution, and ultimately we will leave behind the necessity for the personal psychophysical man, in which case the individual indwelling inner man will become the man again, whole and complete, and at that time there will be no question that that will be our center of consciousness. But while we are still with the outer man, while we are still incarnated in physical forms, then during that process it will always be difficult to evoke the inner man, I think. As you say, with evolution it will become easier, but it will take time.
We know in some cases by the saints, later saints.
Yes, yes. Well, we could instance the Mahatmas as having, through evolution, managed to achieve the faculty, the ability to liberate that inner consciousness. But at what cost? At what cost? Not easy.
HPB describes this egoic consciousness in two places when she's writing to her sister Vera. You remember this? In Mary Neff's book, Memoirs of HPB. And it's quite incredible. It is a state of omniscience.
Mm. Mm. She does give another example. Whether it's quite this, I'm not sure, but there is an article that she wrote called Karmic Visions, which is a fascinating story of karma and follows the processes of reincarnation of one who had, called Clovis, who had lived in the 5th century and had been a Frank, and reincarnated as William III, was it? Prussia. And she says in her introductions that it, or she, not in that, I think she says it somewhere else in a letter, she says that the ego sits and views these scenes as in the article given, and it is the egoic consciousness which is reviewing the processes which have led up to it and seeing the karmic connections and processes at work in this, and seeing, you know, as a whole, and then having this dreadful prevision which is prophetic, I have little doubt, of the First World War. And that it was instrumental.
Talking to Vera, same sort of thing. She was reviewing the past, you see, and she was saying cities and civilizations and all this past her view, and in some cases, even with the dates, and she knew for certain there could be no error. And she said it was so wonderful. But she said it was there was a kind of risk of it stopping. She said, I can't even breathe, or something like that, while I watched.
Yes, yes. Mm.
Has that to do with what is mentioned here, the sovereign will faculty?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Mm.
Can we know anything about that?
Not me. And I suspect when I know, I won't tell you either. The secrets are incommunicable, as they say. Mm. Mm. Well, lastly and fairly briefly, we will have a brief look at section chapter 12. You remember that we have identified 3 schemes of evolution: the physical, the intellectual, and the monadic or spiritual. Well, we've looked in section 10 at the physical scheme and seen the processes which culminated in the physical vehicles that we now use. We have seen the intellectual stream culminating in the indwelling individuality or egoic consciousness. Each of these underpinned by specific classes of dhyanis, whose very essence is woven into the fabric of our being, and without whom neither the physical nor the intellectual development would have been possible. So there is a third stream, we are told, and the same general principles, it seems, are true here as well. Each is ruled and guided, she says, by the highest groups of dhyanis. So presumably the same is true of the third circle on my diagram. And it's that about which I have just a few notes here. There is a passage which I think I've quoted. It's, yes, if you turn to page 137 in 12.2, you see something of the foreshadowing of the whole process of the 7 rounds, where the Mahatma says, "Thus it is but at his 4th round, when arrived at the full possession of his karma energy and completely matured, that man becomes fully responsible. As at the 6th, he may become a Buddha. And at the 7th, before the Pralaya, Adayan Chohan. There's your destiny."
Before is Buddhahood and then the Dayan Chohan?
That comes later. Yeah, they say in another place that the Buddha is a 6th round man, and is so by reason of an exception. But the words that they use to describe the Buddha are fascinating. They speak of him as the greatest, as the holiest man that ever lived. And other such terms as these of extraordinary reverence. He is the patron of all the adepts, they say. But he too, they say, has not completed his human evolution. And when the sixth round will have arrived, even the Buddha will have to reincarnate and continue his evolution. He has merely escaped incarnation for 2 rounds. And his enormous sacrifice by remaining as Nyamanakaya will have exempted him from much, but still and all, he has that yet to do. And at the end of it,
Why has he let out the 5th round here?
I don't know. Ask the Mahatma. I didn't write the letter. I don't know.
To help humanity.
They do say a little about the 5th round. They say that in the 5th round, the consciousness of average humanity will be that of the average ascetic now, implying that the pure and the holy and so forth was what is involved in terms of spiritual consciousness. Not necessarily adept-like, but considerably advanced on the average level of consciousness here today.
If Plato was a 5th rounder, maybe we all have to be Platonic.
I reckon, at the very least, yes.
What
Yes.
a beautiful world. Oh.
This business about in the 7th, the Dayan Chohan, I've quoted you another passage which Joy made reference to when she was talking about stanza 7, which is, again, fascinating. It says, withal, the monad of every living being, and then again, as Joy did, I'll skip the qualification, is an individual Dayan Chohan, distinct from others, a kind of spiritual individuality of its own, during one special manvantara. You are already a Dayan Chohan. You've got a lot to do to become a conscious one, a functional one, but withal, that's what you are now, whether you like it or not. And it'll all go reasonably well, unless the qualification that she puts in the middle applies to you, unless it's moral turpitude, moral evil, breaks the connection and runs loose and astray in the lunar path, whatever that might be, psychic evil. Then it's possible that you might lose that inheritance. Now, this final stage then, we can get just glimpses and hints of. Just glimpses. I mean, if it's difficult enough for us to grasp anything of the true nature of the consciousness and function of the individuality, it's another whole order of magnitude beyond that to imagine what is the consciousness of this indwelling dhyani, this Dayan Chohan, which we shall be finally achieve in becoming, waking up to in the 7th round. I suspect that just as the physical is underpinned by a class of dhyani from whose substance we borrow, just as the mental, the intellectual, is underpinned by the Manasaputra from whose very fabric and substance we borrow, so the same is true as far at the most innermost level as well. And this is suggested in a number of places which we've already seen, one of which I'm going to read you, which is not quoted in the book, but I have referred you to it and suggested that you do read it. And that's in volume 1, page 573.
Page 7 what?
573. There is much in this area that you should read. This particular passage I will draw your attention to. I'm going to start reading at the bottom of 572, the last paragraph, the star under which a human entity is born. You all got that? The star under which a human entity is born, says the occult teaching, will remain forever its star throughout the whole cycle of its incarnations in one manvantara. But this is not his astrological star. The latter, the astrological star, is concerned and connected with his personality. The former, the star that she started to talk about, with the individuality. I think she's using individuality even in a higher sense than I've been using it up to now, and in which she traditionally uses it. Now this comes from and goes back to this teaching about the 7 rays, that the monads are the primeval emanations. There's a passage, I think, on just the previous page. I'm just sort of making a little detour. I will come back to this passage, but there's a lovely little passage which gives you the feel for this. Back on page 571, where it says, Atma, our 7th principle, being identical with the universal spirit, and man being one with it in his essence, what is then the monad proper? It is that homogeneous spark which radiates in millions of rays from the primeval 7, of which further on. It is the emanating spark from the uncreated ray, a mystery. Another of Joy's mysteries. Emanated spark from the uncreated ray. I sense one flame. I see countless undetached sparks burning in the dark midnight sky. It's the same idea. So with this. Now, the primeval 7 that she's referring to will no doubt have many meanings, but in this particular passage she talks of the 7, as opposed to the exoteric 5, the 7 dhyani Buddhas as being the archetypes of these 7 rays. So going on with the passage that we started with, the star under which the human entity is born will remain forever his star throughout the whole cycle of his incarnations in one Manvantara. The angel of that star, or the Dhyani Buddha, will be either the guiding or simply the presiding angel, so to say, in every new rebirth of the monad, which is part of his own essence. And that is the passage that she has underlined and put in italics, which is part of his own essence. So the monad itself is emanated from, is an aspect of that ray, that Dhyani Buddha. And that is the sense in which I think this 3rd scheme, the monadic scheme, is to be understood. So part of his own essence, though his vehicle, man, may remain forever ignorant of this fact. Oh, little man, as we say right down at the bottom here, the personality, you may remain forever ignorant of it. And then you get this other qualification which shows just how innermost this is. The adepts have each their Dhyani Buddha, their elder twin soul, and they know it, calling it Father Soul and Father Fire. It is only at the last and supreme initiation, however, that they learn it, when placed face to face with the bright image. So this is way beyond, way beyond anything that we are going to touch. But it is at least a promise, at least something toward which we grope, even if we cannot really, in consciousness, understand too much of what is being said here.
Doesn't say it, Adam. If we have one type of character, says in the bottom there are 7 Buddha. Dhyani Shohans, that mean there are what other people call it the 7 rays, the 7 different characters.
Mm-hmm.
So
Not characters in this case. You see, this 7-fold is buried so deep that it is nothing to do with either personality or character as we understand it, and therefore nothing that we could say about it would touch on what this is about. And all the sorts of stuff which we hear about the 7 rays, especially from Alice Bailey, who writes about this, and the sorts of characteristics which are attributed to these 7 rays could have nothing to do with these 7 Dhyani Buddhas. This is so innermost, so divine in character, that we really cannot imagine in what way one is different from another. 1 or 2 clues, 1 or 2 very obscure hints are given by Subarao in his esoteric writings. But they are hints, and again, it, as HVB would say, it is left to the intuition of the student.
Because the 7 colors are 7 different colors. The 7 notes are 7 different notes. And whatever the notes or color or whatever we had inherited in this Manvantara, we have to go through the whole Manvantara.
It'll always be the same, from start to finish. The ray from which your monad has emanated, and in which essence it is enshrined and lives, will be its ray for good and all. Couldn't be otherwise.
If we can't envisage the egoic state,
What on earth could we say about that?
how are we going to
Yeah.
even begin to imagine what the others know? Different thought again.
It's most logical that the outer man remains ignorant. How can he
Benefit.
ever know? Because the capacity is not even present. And when we think that we haven't even developed all the capacities within that particular
Right.
framework, that ring pass knot, it's inconceivable. We're trying
Right.
to, it's like the kindergarten child trying to comprehend advanced calculus.
Right.
The task.
Only 1,000 times more so.
Or even a
Yeah.
dozen, yeah.
Yes.
Do you think, though, that there's something when Jesus walked and said to a man, "Come with me," and that man went with him, that there was a recognition, even at that very low level, that they were in a group who were to work together? Can it
I
come
don't
down
know.
to that? Because there's,
I don't know.
in some of the, when the great spiritual teachers come, they seem to recognize and are recognized. So one man will come,
Certainly.
but not another.
Well, I'm at a loss, Lillian. It's quite beyond me to make intelligent comment. Subarao has some thoughts on this, and he talks about the various religions as associated with particular rays.
Yeah.
I merely read what you say and note it, but I have no comment to make.
Yeah.
It's beyond me to know whether it's right or wrong. But it's interesting to note that he does say that an adept community will be made up of adepts of different rays, not necessarily all of the same ray.
The adepts.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
it's not as if that they become all one ray, all adepts of one ray congregated together and operate
No.
together. It's
There wouldn't be balance.
just so.
It's the harmonic notes of the universe. Impossible to be one ray.
Well, just one last couple of thoughts, because it's already 5:30. So let me just I would like just to get one or two other ideas
It's the
across.
last one.
It's the last one. You're right there. The last of the last, the 7th of the 7th. There are processes at work here in this third scheme of evolution, and we get glimpses of it from time to time. And one of those glimpses I have quoted you from the Mahatma letters, and it is on page 138, 12.6. And I think this is well worth reading through and considering. At the beginning of each round, when humanity reappears under quite different conditions from those afforded for the birth of each new race and its sub-races, a planetary, a dhyani, has to mix with those primitive men and refresh their memories and reveal to them the truth they knew during the preceding round. Do you see a principle involved here which we've seen before? Just as the Ishta that we'd seen have to maintain the physical form for the physical continuity, so in this scheme, a planetary, a god, a dhyani, whatever you want to call it, has to also act in this way so as to maintain the stock of knowledge and provide continuity between one round and another. But that happens only for the benefit of the first race. He pushes off after that. It is the duty of the latter, the first race, to choose the fit recipients among its sons who are set apart, to use a biblical phrase, as the vessels to contain the whole stock of knowledge, to be divided among the future races and generations until the close of that round. Every race has its adepts, and with every new age we are allowed to give them out as much of our knowledge as the men of that race deserve. The last, seventh race will have its Buddha, as every one of its predecessors had, but its adepts will be far higher than any of the present race, for among them will abide the future planetary, the Dian Chohan, whose duty it will be to instruct or refresh the memory of the first race of the fifth round men after this planet's future obscuration. So just as it starts with the planetary, the seed Manu, so it will end at the other end with the root Manu, who will contain the stock of knowledge and the spiritual wisdom, the inheritance, and carry it forward, modified, enhanced, enriched, as the seed for the future mankind. It's a beautiful picture, isn't it? And this, I'm sure, is concerned and directly involved with this third scheme, the spiritual or monadic scheme for the evolution. And the last passage that you see here is, Joy has already read to you. And this is the one about the silent watcher. And this again, I am sure, is concerned with the same scheme. In my notes there, is it the same or another still higher is referred to in this final passage? Well, who knows? It's left to you to sense and judge for yourself. That he is the initiator called the Great Sacrifice. For sitting at the threshold of light, he looks into it from within the circle of darkness, which he will not cross, nor will he quit his post till the last day of this life cycle. Why does the solitary watcher stay at his self-chosen post? Why does he sit by the fountain of primeval wisdom, of which he drinks no longer, as he has naught to learn which he does not know, aye, neither on this earth nor in its heaven? Because the lonely, sore-footed pilgrims, on their way back to their home, are never sure till the last minute of not losing their way in this limitless desert of illusion and matter called earth life. Because he would fain show the way to that region of freedom and light, from which he is a voluntary exile himself, to every prisoner who has succeeded in liberating himself from the bonds of flesh and illusion, because, in short, he has sacrificed himself for the sake of mankind, though but a few elect may profit by the great sacrifice. Well, there you are, folks.